Okay, everyone, welcome to what I am going to call Tiny Potato Productions. It is a production studio for your classroom from here on to the end of the semester. It will be taking place in my office, which I would like to give you just a brief tour of. Purdue University Diploma, 1993. Budweiser Beer School Diploma, also 1997. That was when Busch Gardens still gave you trams over to the brewery. Masters of Arts in Counseling, University of Denver. This is my Harvard monkey from my best friend Max, running the Harvard Evolutionary Psychology Laboratory. What other things? Picture of the guys, we don't talk about that. PhD, University of California. Wall of toys. Hey, Bob's Burgers. Rick and Morty. My children. Tom. There's Maria. The all-important drip coffee machine, followed up by the almost as important espresso machine. Purdue University flag, for those of you who know just how much fun I had there. Purdue Varsity Glee Club patch that went into space on the space shuttle. Many astronauts are from my alma mater. Paddles, Psych, Phi Beta Kappa. I'm putting my academic robes up to block the light as we record. One of my favorite things, little Darwin bobblehead. This, by the way, is the bobblehead of me that my students decided I needed to have when I was leaving the University of Victoria. Probably one of the sweetest and most thoughtful gifts I have ever received. There is my typical coffee mug. There is the strap I would always have around my pants because I biked to school every day. Paddle for pledging Delta Upsilon 1993. We don't talk about that much either. And that's about it. Candy for if we ever come back to campus all together, you can stop by and grab some. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to sit down here at my desk, flip the camera around, and here we go. When we broke last time, we were talking about the personality structures associated with Freud. I had a little video from The Simpsons, which, for the last time, wouldn't play. And so here it is. Basically what's happening in this clip is a very well-informed and intellectual group of writers that work on The Simpsons is well aware of classic Freudian psychology and decided to make an explicit conversation in Homer's head happen between his id and his ego. Typically, these conversations are not carried out in English. These conversations are not carried out at the level of consciousness. But of course, well, you know, Homer, he's fictional. Yeah, he's not so much real. So here it is.
Ow, pointy! Ew, slimy. Uh-oh, moving. Uh-huh. Aw, $20. I wanted a peanut. $20 can buy many peanuts. Explain how. Money can be exchanged for goods and services. Woohoo!
Speaking of what is available to the brain in terms of being aware and what is available to the brain in terms of not being aware, Freud also proposed some structures of mind, including the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious or non-conscious or subconscious. These are many terms that float around almost interchangeably. And this is what a lot of people say, oh, well, give Freud credit, he was right. Maybe in the most vague sort of a sense. But Freud did decide to go ahead and differentiate between what he saw as the kind of things that we could be aware of and talk about. That's what he called the conscious. But that most of what was going on in our minds, most of what was going on in our brains was either in the preconscious, which is something that could be made conscious with introspection and inflection and exploration. But there were other things in the unconscious that never really were going to be made explicit. That somebody might be able to educate you about, that somebody might be able to inform you about, but you were never going to be aware of it any more than you are aware of the chemical reactions in your liver. Just never going to happen. So the unconscious is really where the id dwells. You're never really necessarily aware of it. You're never aware of what it's thinking. You're never aware of what it wants. And if you were, you'd probably be pretty freaking disturbed. And the ego's mediation between the id and the superego is also something that doesn't really happen in language or happen in consciousness. But you can start to explore its machinations. You can start to explore its functioning if you have a well-educated expert guide, like a psychotherapist. And what you might find out if you worked with that educated, expensive medical establishment guide that was the psychotherapist were some of the ways in which your personality structures interacted with each other and helped to keep you functional, I suppose, steady, not a sobbing mess of absolute dysfunction as you went throughout life. And those mechanisms are called defense mechanisms. A very, very early developing popular defense mechanism is the one that's called denial. You may have heard of denial. Denial is still a word that's used quite a bit in everyday vocabulary. Denial is basically the idea that if you come across something that is true, but it causes you a lot of discomfort because it creates conflict between your personality structures or conflict between the kind of thing that you're thinking and the kind of thing that you're worried that people might think that you're thinking, then denial is essentially saying that thing that I found out that is true, it is not true. Denial is what is usually known as an immature defense mechanism. It might hold the gates back against uncomfortable information for a while, but it really doesn't hold up forever, and it can be punctured. It can crumble under too much force. Rationalization is a bit more mature, but still not a terribly good defense mechanism. It's designed to create an explanation to deal with a threatening thought or deal with a threatening action, which is to say, you figure out a way to tell yourself that something was in fact moral or acceptable when it really wasn't. I can give you an example. I'm a great rationalizer. Rationalization is probably my favorite defense mechanism, and everybody needs one. But here's something I did a while back. When I was in graduate school, I had a internship, and during that internship, I was studying for the qualification examination for after the master's class, and there was a large packet of study information that I wanted a copy of because a classmate of mine had a copy of it, and so I took that into work and I used the copy at work to run off a couple of reams. It was like 200-300 pages worth of stuff. And a part of me was thinking, man, I have access to this copier. I know that material isn't free. I know that paper isn't free. I know that ink isn't free. Toner isn't free. But at the same time, they offered to buy me like a day planner a couple weeks ago, and I didn't really need one, and so I said, no thanks, I don't need that. So I figured I had about $20 worth of credit to use to make copies with, and it all kind of come out the wash. That was a rationalization. When it was discovered that I'd run off so many copies for something that was basically not work-related, there was trouble, and there should have been. It was not a good thing for me to have done. But the rationalization held until, again, it was punctured by somebody saying, hey, that's not accurate, that's not true, that's not real, and here are the consequences. Projection, this is a pretty pernicious one. This is one where basically if you know that you've got an issue, if you know that you've got something that's making you feel uncomfortable, then you basically say, whatever that thing is that I'm dealing with, no, that's the thing that you're dealing with. And you make an accusation before you have to field an accusation. And then the thing about projections is that when somebody actually brings the truth to you, it kind of looks like a counter accusation right away. You're only attacking me because I pointed the truth out about you. That's projection. One of the kind of classic now, and I don't know if it is statistically true, it's probably not, but these stories probably get a lot of attention, is that it seems to be often the case that some of the most vocal, virulent, hateful, anti-gay politicians end up coming out, or being outed usually, as gay themselves. That would be a projection. You're gay, that's a problem for you, you, when in fact it was me. That gets us right into the reaction formation defense mechanism, which is this. If you have something that you feel uncomfortable with, if you have an intrapsychic conflict between your id and your superego, that your ego is not having a great time fielding, then you might want to act for all the world like the opposite of your conflict is happening. So if you're uncomfortable about the idea that you're gay, maybe your actions should all be very, 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 very much like you're not. There we go, reaction formation. The reaction formation is interesting because it gives us one of the biggest problems with Freudian psychology, which is this. A reaction formation allows a therapist to be right no matter what it is that you are doing. If you have a problem with hoarding and spending and not spending money, hoarding food, hoarding goods, and that's your real psychological problem, but the behavior that is observed is of you giving everything away and being super generous, the therapist now has a card they can play. It's like an Uno reverse. It's like, oh, your problem is hoarding, but your reaction formation is making you very generous. Well, in that case, if you're a therapist now, you never have to be wrong. You're either right or somebody has a reaction formation and they're doing the opposite of what you would expect. So one of the reasons why psychodynamic explanations kind of suffer on the scientific end. Anyway, the last defense mechanism I want to talk about is sublimation. This is the one that is, in fact, for lack of a better word, good. If you're going to have a defense mechanism to mediate the conflict between an id and a superego, sublimation is about the best one that you can use because it takes that energy and that discomfort from that psychic conflict and puts it towards a useful activity in society. A great example of sublimation is activity in sports. If you've got a lot of psychic energy because you have a lot of uncomfortable conflict, but you go and you take it to the soccer field or you take it to the swimming pool or you burn it all off through physical activity, great, very pro-social, kind of productive, well done, sublimation. If you work really, really, really hard at a charity because you have so much anxiety about the world, great, you've sublimated, well done. Freud would be very happy with you. I've already touched on a few of the criticisms of psychodynamic theory. Let's just lay them all out explicitly in the next slide. One of the problems with psychodynamic theory is that it is really, really horribly sexist. I mentioned this in class the week before we broke, but Freud's story about how we get a conscience, how we get that little voice inside of us that tells us what's right and tells us what's wrong, comes from castration anxiety. The fear that you are going to have your father castrate you is the thing that really gets you in tune with the morals of the world so that you can stay safe from an otherwise vengeful parent. The Oedipus complex is the thing that kicks off castration anxiety. You're attracted to your mother, you're afraid that might piss off your father, you're afraid that he might castrate you, and so you develop a conscience. Penis envy was something that Freud also talked about. Girls had penis envy, so they wanted to be more like, I don't even remember that whole one. It's really kind of a messed up story. But it really kind of left open the idea of how a typical, normal, healthy female psychology would develop. So they kind of had to add on after the fact the Electra complex, another Greek mythological story about a daughter who had attraction to her father. They said, well, what about womb envy? Maybe boys are jealous of the idea that their moms can have babies in the same way that girls are jealous of the idea that their dads have penises, and so that makes it kind of No. Okay, this is all kind of after the fact attempts to make this a decent explanation. The other thing is that Freudian psychology was classist. There was nothing at stake except for the concerns of semi-aristocratic, largely stay-at-home, upper-middle-class patients in Vienna, Victorian Vienna. And that's really not a great story to tell about all of humanity if you're just really getting into the personal details of only that group of people. And at the very end of the day, the work of science is not done by Freudian psychology. The work of science is to give probabilistically true statements about the underlying functioning of the natural world. Freudian psychology didn't do this. It did not synthesize or integrate observations in a way that was open to being disproved, and it certainly didn't use that framework to demonstrate its truth by making good, sound, accurate predictions about what you should see if the theory was true that differentiated that theory from other theories. The best way to think about Freudian contributions to psychology is that the psychodynamic story was an allegory, a narrative, a mythology. It was like Lord of the Rings. I mean, maybe a good story, maybe quite engaging. Maybe it can help people if they engage with that world or engage with that story. And even if they believe it, it might help them get a sense that they now have an understanding or control over their own destiny, which can in itself, I suppose, be helpful. But does that make it true? It really doesn't. And so as a scientist, I am very anti-Freud, I suppose, is a good way to put it. During my years as a therapist, the criteria about what you say are much different. As a therapist, you're just looking for things that are useful. As a scientist, you're looking for things that are true. And so I think that different people in different fields of psychology might have very different attitudes about what it is that Freud said. Okay. That stuff is kind of one area of a personality chapter. Coming up, we're going to do a more scientific exploration of what personality actually is, but I think it's probably a really good time for a break.
This time I would wager in all of your living memories, I now am proud to present to you the life and times of Ernest Miller Hemingway in approximately 3.5 minutes. Go! Born in Chicago in 1899, son of a physician and a musician, reasonably uneventful childhood, decided to study journalism. Enlisted with the Red Cross during World War I, got blown up in Milan and spent 6 months in hospital with severe shrapnel wounds in both legs. Fell in love with a nurse, they decided to get married. He came home to prepare, she stayed there and ditched him for an Italian soldier, which initiated a lifelong pattern of him rejecting women before they had a chance to reject him. Take note, Maddie. Got a job as a foreign correspondent, fell in love with his roommate's sister, married her and moved to Paris. They hung out with Gertrude Stein, they kicked it with Pablo Picasso. He started writing in earnest, no pun intended, moved to Toronto, had a kid, moved back to Paris, published a couple of books, cheated on his wife, got divorced, married the other woman, converted to Catholicism, cut his head open after pulling on a cord thinking he was flushing a toilet and instead ripped a skylight from the roof and smashed it onto his face. Moved to Kansas City, had another kid, his dad committed suicide, he shot a lot of bears for some reason. Had a car accident, had another kid, went to Africa to kill some wild animals and got dysentery, karma. Published another book, moved to Cuba, shot himself in the leg whilst aiming at a shark. Cheated on his wife, got divorced, married the other woman, published For Whom the Bell Tolls, sold 500,000 copies in a couple of months and got nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, cheated on his wife, got divorced, married the other woman, became the self-appointed leader of a band of village militia outside of Paris and was subsequently brought up on charges for contravening the Geneva Convention and got away with it like a fucking champion. Got pneumonia, moved back to Cuba and spent most of his spare time on his boat tracking Nazi U-boats with a machine gun and a pile of hand grenades. I am not making this shit up! Had a few more car accidents, 3 more concussions, got clawed while playing with a lion. Got depressed, drank, got fat, published a couple more books, went back to Africa to shoot some more wild animals, and barely survived 2 separate plane crashes in the space of 24 hours, winding up with a fractured skull, internal bleeding, cracked spine, ruptured liver, first-degree burns, and a paralysed sphincter muscle. Come on! Won a Nobel Prize, had a file opened on him by J. Edgar Hoover, left a bunch of shit in a safe in Cuba and moved to Idaho, paranoid that the feds were following him, which they were because he spent most of the 1940s working for the KGB. Again, not making this shit up. Suffered from hepatitis, nephritis, hypertension, hemochromatosis, anemia and impotence. Karma. Got committed, received way too much electroconvulsive therapy and came out all fucked up, started hinting at suicide, so immediately got recommitted, received another couple of months worth of electroconvulsive therapy, got released, put both barrels of his favourite 12-gauge shotgun into his mouth and blew his fucking head off. What a guy!
That was 3 minutes and 30 seconds of Randy Feltface talking about the Ernest Hemingway biography. That is the first clip of Randy that I ever saw, and it got me into hours and hours of some of his best stuff. So I hope you enjoyed it. Let's get back into what exactly personality actually is. What is personality? It's easy to think that personality is basically anything about a person. But if you think about it for a second, that would make it a pretty unwieldy explanation for a chapter in a psychology book. Anything about a person that happens in the mind would be called psychology, not personality. It would take up the whole book instead of just one chapter. So what is it within the field of psychology that makes personality its own subject, its own topic? And so here's where we go. Here's where we have to kind of put some constraints on what is personality and what is not personality. So I'm going to call personality, and the book is going to call personality, a pattern of characteristics by which each person can be contrasted with other people. This makes a lot of sense, and this actually takes the definition and makes it narrower than just things about people. So personality traits, for one, differentiate people. Personality traits make one person different from another person. So things that are common to all people aren't going to show up as personality traits. That's why I say I like food is not a personality trait. Everybody likes food, okay? Some people might like food more than others, so you might want to sort that out. But really, in the end, the idea that there are some people who like food and some people who don't in the general population, not. So it's not really a personality trait. Personality traits are also stable across time. You don't feel like a certain thing one day and call it a personality trait and feel a different way the next day, and that's your new personality trait. If you say, I feel like having Chinese food like one night, then that's not a personality trait. That's just something that's true for the situation or true for that time, but it really doesn't count as a personality unless it sticks with you in a way that helps to define you over time. And that's another thing. It has to be stable across situations. If you're a different person in every situation that you find yourself in, if you're a different person completely at school versus at work versus at home versus on vacation, then the way that you are can't really be said to follow you. So it's not really a personality. This actually has gotten the field into quite a bit of debate and hot water because some people claim quite strongly that there is very little continuity for a person across situations, and that the way they act and the way they behave is determined quite a lot by the situation they find themselves in at any given time. If that was true, personality psychology really would have a hard time persisting, and so we're going to have to kind of gloss over that debate and move on. But just so you know, it is kind of a debate. So how do we go about describing what is going on with personality? Well, personality is largely concerned with defining and measuring personality traits, those things that are stable for a person across time and across situation and differentiates them from other people. So what we really need to do is create a list of things that might qualify as personality traits. And one of the earliest efforts to do this was actually by a couple of people, love their names, Allport and Odbert, who basically just did nothing more than go through the dictionary and find all of the words that could be used to describe somebody. They found 18,000 such words, and then they gave people questionnaires, and they said, hey, think about a person or think about yourself. Which of these words apply to you? Maybe they didn't give all 18,000 at a time to everybody, but a certain subsection. And what they realized is that there might be 18,000 words, but there weren't 18,000 different meanings. So, if somebody was a nice person, and if you put nice as one of the things that was true about them, but then you also put kind, generous, happy, loving, if all of those words were also checked on every single paper that had nice, then those were all one cluster of meaning, and they didn't really do anything to differentiate people. So by mathematically tracking which words hung together in which people and which words tended not to describe a person and was never paired with another word, they started to realize what kind of words could differentiate one person from another. After all that was done, they could mathematically also kind of sort out how many such clusters there were. Depending on how fine-grained you wanted to get into the math, you could pull back and look for just large clusters of words, or you could go in further and further and further and find smaller and smaller ones. But they figured that a pretty good resolution gave you a manageable number of trait clusters, and they decided, okay, those are the words that we're going to use to make a taxonomy of traits. Once they were done with their little project, other people came along and said, let's make that number very, very small. Let's make the number of traits that might describe one person versus another person like 2. So here comes Eysenck, okay? And Eysenck proposed what he called the biological dimensions. Why did he call them biological dimensions? Well, not because there was a whole lot of evidence that the traits he was looking for were strictly determined by biology, but he was nevertheless convinced that they were, and then proceeded to describe them. So, extroversion and introversion was one dimension where people could fall either to the extroverted side or to the introverted side. And there was the neuroticism level, where people could either go high on neuroticism, which made them emotional, or low on neuroticism, which made them stable. Introversion, extroversion is something that sticks with personality theory and trait theory throughout every theory that you can possibly read. And I like to have it described to me this way. An extrovert differs from an introvert, not by whether or not they never want to interact with people, not in terms of whether they always want to be alone, but by the effect that their interaction with other people has on them. Now, this is not a terribly scientific way of stating this, but it's always made a lot of intuitive sense to me. Here's the deal. If you're an extrovert and you seek social interaction, after that social interaction, you will feel exalted, energized, happy, kind of ready for more. The introvert, after having been in a social interaction, will be tired, exhausted, not ready for more, ready to curl up and isolate for a little while. Now, the introvert might not regret having interacted. It might feel wonderful. It might be a really happy memory. They might say, man, I'm really glad I did that. But they might feel a lot more like a person feels after they've had a nice big workout or a long run and say, man, that feels really exhausting and satisfying, but I sure need to rest up before I do that again. So, what Eysenck said differentiated the introverts from the extroverts was this: their baseline level of arousal. This also has a lot to do with thrill seeking. So here's the basic idea. If you have an internal level of arousal that is already really, really high, which is to say, your brain is going a mile a minute, you're always thinking about things, you're always working out problems, you're always maybe even ruminating or having a fight with your roommate or your dad or your brother or your sister like years after it happened, you're already pretty busy on the inside and you don't need more things to do. In that case, you'll be likely to be an extrovert. You don't need to go outside and seek external stimulation to get you to a comfortable level of arousal because you're kind of always at an almost uncomfortable level of arousal. But the extrovert will have a little bit quieter of a mental life, let's say. And so extra thrills, extra stimulation, extra excitement is something they might crave to get to a comfortable and happy level of arousal. So they might be more willing to hang out with people and be gregarious and cheerful and happy, but they might also be willing to do things like, or seek out things like jumping out of planes or doing extreme sports or snowboarding or whatever. So this is all linked to the idea that this is determined by level of arousal. Neuroticism, on the other hand, had to do with your overall level of sensitivity to stress, your reactions to things. If you were basically not terribly reactive to stress, something stresses you out and you brush it off, then I think would say you're emotionally stable. But if stress really tips you off one way or another and gets you to with a large reaction, then he'd say you're probably going to be neurotic or unstable or emotional. That same taxonomy of traits was tackled by another theorist who basically agreed with the taxonomy, but had some different ideas about where the differences came from. It wasn't necessarily a different descriptive theory, but it was a different explanatory theory. Gray, this is Gray. Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory started in with an explanation that eventually, and we'll get to this, carried over to some of the things that the humanists ended up believing and thinking about. He said that the difference between an introvert and an extrovert was whether you were driven by the go system. The go system is a system that motivates behavior by the imagination and seeking and pursuit of rewards. What do you call the behavioral approach system? What are you going to do? I'm going to go out there and approach my rewards. I'm going to go find something new. I'm going to get it. Something that wasn't there before is going to be for me here now, and that's going to make me happy. I'm going to go get my thing. Okay, that was the extrovert's definition. They were sensitive to the go system, and they were sensitivity to the possibility that they were going to get reward. Neuroticism, on the other hand, was something that was more driven by emotional people being sensitive to rewards and punishments. The punishments was the stop system, the behavioral inhibition system. So to make sure that all these puzzle pieces fit together, in case I didn't just make it exactly clear, extroversion introversion is whether or not you are more of a go person or less of a go person. That is to say, more of a go person driven by rewards, or more of a stop person who's driven by the avoidance of punishments. Neuroticism brought into the idea of whichever one of these is functional for you, your sensitivity to rewards and your sensitivity to punishment is what makes you neurotic or makes you stable. So if you're very sensitive to either reward or punishment, you're likely to be neurotic. If you're not terribly sensitive to either and you kind of stay steady no matter whether there are a lot of rewards on your plate or there are a lot of punishments in the air, then you will tend to be more stable. So that is Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory. Extroversion introversion is what it is that motivates your behavior, and that sensitivity is how sensitive you are to when those things happen. The big one in personality theory, and that's why it's called the Big Five, is the Big Five. The Big Five trait theory was put out by McCrae and Costa. They still remain basically the giants of personality theory yet to this day. And they laid out 5 dimensions, basically also through a factor analysis, that tend to do a good job of differentiating people from each other. But once you identify a person, then all of their, along one of these traits, along one of these axes, then all of their traits tend to follow along with that description. The 5 are conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness to experience, and extroversion. Why is there a picture of a canoe? Well, because just coincidentally, C, A, N, O, and E are the 5 traits. Oh, get it? All right, cool. Conscientiousness is what we might call anal retentiveness. Sorry, it is the ability for you to be organized, careful, disciplined. You plan ahead. Your ducks are in a row. You are conscientious. You're organized. Agreeableness is the degree to which you will be empathic, will worry about other people's feelings, will worry about other people's experiences. You will not be suspicious of them. You will not withhold what you have just in case they can't do right by you. You'll be trusting, you'll be helpful, and you'll be generous. Neuroticism basically stays the same from the previous trait taxonomies. That is your ability to be emotionally stable. If you are emotionally stable, you're low on neuroticism. If you're not emotionally stable, you're high on neuroticism. Openness to experience, that was a new one that came in, definitely, and had not been on the table before. But the degree to which you are a nonconformist, to which what everybody else is doing doesn't really interest you. You will do something new, do something different, even if a lot of people will look at you sideways and wonder why it is that you're acting so weird. So openness to experience, a different personality trait. Extroversion, well, we've already covered that one as well. That one kind of remained untouched in through this theory from the other theories. Can't really get through a personality discussion without talking about types. And when I say types, I mean type indicator. You may have already heard of, you may have already experienced the MBTI, otherwise known as the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So what the heck? Let's go for it. Let's go ahead and give you a Myers-Briggs type indicator reading. We can do it right now. Got a piece of paper? Can you make 4 marks on it? Fantastic. So this is a very, very quick 4-question survey that will give you an idea about where you score in the Myers-Briggs type indicator. First question. I like to meet new people and take action, or reflect on my thoughts and ideas. If you are not sure which one of those describes you, I would say fill in one of the bubbles in the middle around 5 or 6. But if you strongly agree that you like to meet new people and take action, then circle a 1. If you strongly agree that you like to reflect on your thoughts and ideas, then circle a 10. All right? So on this question, you've got anywhere between a 1 and a 10. Next question. I trust the tangible and love specific details. If you strongly agree, put a 1. If you say, I trust the abstract and love to generalize a pattern, then circle a 10 because you strongly agree with that. 3, I make decisions through detached, rational, and logical thought. If you are under the impression that that describes you, then go ahead and strongly agree with a 1. But if you say, I make decisions by getting a feel for the situation and looking for consensus, then circle 10. If neither one of those or you're not sure, then stay in the middle. 5 and 6 is fine as well. Last one, I prefer to have matters settled. If that describes you, then that's a 1. If you prefer to keep decisions open, then circle a 10, because that you strongly agree with that. All right, here is what your Myers-Briggs type is based on how you answered those 4 questions. Question 1 was about extroversion versus introversion. Question 2 was about sensing versus intuition. Question 3 was about thinking versus feeling. And question 4 was about judging versus perceiving. So based on how strong you were on either direction for any of those questions, that is going to be your Myers-Briggs type. So E and I, S and N, T and F, J and P. Let's go back and just make sure that you know what the right thing is. Extroversion, of course, is if you had a low score on that. Introversion is if you had a high score. Tangible, if you trust the tangible and love specific details. Gonna have to go back here again. Sorry about that. Oh yes, that was sensing versus intuition. If you like the tangible and love specific details, then that was sensing. And if you like the abstract and generalize a pattern, that is intuition. If you like detached, rational, and logical thought, then you are thinking. If you like to get a feel for the situation and look for consensus, you are feeling. And if you like to have matters settled, then you have judgment. But if you like to keep decisions open, then you are P for perceiving. Okay, so a lot of ENTPs out there, a lot of ISTJs, whatever you are, now you can say you have your Myers-Briggs type. Was it a messy process? Yeah, sorry about that. It's also a messy test because here's the thing. If you like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, you might also like horoscopes. That's a little bit of a stretch, but not much, okay? People who give the Myers-Briggs as a group building activity in a business or a group are having everybody do a fun project together and giving them the impression that they have insight into other people's personality and now have a better idea about how to work together. It is sometimes very useful to give people that impression, but it doesn't validate the measure itself, okay? So if anybody's going to be a professional and look at personality for any kind of clinical or diagnostic or empirical reason, they're not going to use the Myers-Briggs type indicator because it doesn't really tell you all that much more about a person than whether they're a Sagittarius or a Gemini. I happen to be a Gemini. I have no idea what that says about me, but I'm pretty sure that any one of the things that I've done in my life could be just about as easily fit into a Gemini description as any of the other zodiacs. So now I'm crapping on both Myers-Briggs and the zodiac, so let's just move on from there. Next question, is personality inherited? I got an answer for you. Yes, but it's more nuanced than that. Yes, it is. All right. To get a little bit more nuanced than that, I will have to say this. There are things other than genes that affect your personality. But if you started to classify, mathematically describe the amount of difference between people on personality traits, you would come to realize that about 50% of the reasons why people are different from each other on personality traits seems to track the genes that they have by virtue of who they are related to biologically or genetically. The other 50% seems to be something having to do with environmental factors. But the surprising thing for most people is that approximately 0%, sometimes measurable, sometimes not measurable, sometimes a little bit larger, sometimes not large at all, but approximately 0% of the environment that affects your personality seems to be tied to who your parents are. There's a money quote from Judith Ridge Harris, a researcher but not an academic, who wrote a book called The Nurture Assumption that I cover pretty heavily when I do my development class. And here's the money quote from a TV special featuring her. Which home a child is raised in, whether he's raised in the Smith's home or the Jones home, seems to have no long-term effects on the personality or the intelligence of the adult individual. That is a very carefully crafted sentence to make a lot of caveats that don't seem like caveats, but here's the deal. Whether it's in the Smith's home or the Jones home, that basically says as long as you are in a relatively typical, normal environment, not an extreme environment, not a wartime environment, childhood, not an extremely abusive home, nothing too far outside of the ordinary, then within the normal variation of human existence, we don't see a lot of difference at the end of the day in terms of personality. It's also about long-term effects. Parents might have more of an effect on the personality of their kid when their kid is young and is spending all of their time at home, and their actions and their decisions are being constrained and given feedback constantly by those parents. But by the time they are adults and you are measuring them, those effects have washed out or gone away if they ever existed. And the other thing is, it's not necessarily the case that parents don't have any effect on anything about you, but personality and intelligence are just two things that tend to be stable for people over the long term that don't seem to have a lot of response to parental involvement. Other things that you could measure about somebody certainly might. Achievement, education might. Relationship status, whether you're divorced. I mean, those are other things that you can measure that might have a bigger parental influence. But when it comes to personality and intelligence, we're not really finding a lot. Here are the data, and this is something that's not in your textbook, but it's in another textbook. Plowman and Caspi, sorry, that's cut off, 1999. So it's a little bit old, but if human beings haven't changed, then it still holds. Said that basically when you broke down the twin studies research for each one of the big 5 personality traits, you find a little bit more of a parental influence. In this chart, it's called shared environment, the influence of having the same parent for some personality traits and zero measurable effect in other ones. So it seems like openness to experience is the thing that potentially has the biggest long-term influence from parents, and that maxes out at maybe 10% of the variance due to parenting. But things like conscientiousness and neuroticism don't have a measurable effect of parenthood at all. Agreeableness, maybe a couple of percent. Extroversion, maybe about 5-7%. So the thing to keep in mind is that for all of these, right about 50% or so, maybe a little above, maybe a little bit below, seems to be due to genetic factors, and the rest of it is somewhere mysteriously in the environment. By the way, Judy Harris, the person that I quoted in the last slide, seems to be under the impression and is gathering data or kicked off the gathering of data that the biggest influencing factor in that environment that is not your parents is the people that you counted as your peers when you were a young adult. Those people seem formative. Those people seem to be shaping who you are as a grown-up, as opposed to your parents. I think it's about a good time to stop for the day. I got another clip for you if you want to watch it. Tune back in. I'll have another video posted for you before Wednesday hits, and keep in mind that your exam is going to be on Friday morning. Make sure that you are logged in at class time. I will give you extra time to turn in your exam, but it'll be given over Scholar, and I think it's going to go just fine. Study guides for Chapter 10 are already up. Study guide for Chapter 11 should go up before the next lecture hits YouTube. Take care, you guys.